Alrighty, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to jump into the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s. So sit back and relax. I think this is one of the more important elements of the post-World War II era. So we really want to understand kind of where the civil rights movement came from and what its goals were, and what hopefully in the end we understand its successes and its limitations, and what that can tell us about some of the struggles that we deal with today. Because I think in a lot of ways, most of what the civil rights movement was trying to do, we are still trying to do. All right, and most of what the civil rights movement was demanding, we are still demanding. So I think it's important to understand what they did and why they did and how they did it, so we can understand who we are and what we could do going forward. You have to remember that by the 1890s, really, as Reconstruction came to an end in the 1870s and 80s, by the 1890s, using what they call the Mississippi Plan, the eventually Jim Crow, the southern states had completely started to take back a lot of um, rights and freedoms that had been guaranteed to African Americans as the Civil War ended. Remember, the Civil War ends. Radical Republicans in Congress had passed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which had granted rights and really had stopped denying rights to African Americans and granted citizenship to African Americans. But by the 1890s, with Plessy versus Ferguson, that had all changed, and this became the norm, right? And Jim Crow was a very subversive and horrific system that was put in place that that subjugated African Americans to white Americans in the South and all over the nation. And so you've seen probably iconic images of these like the segregation, the black waiting room versus the white waiting room. All right. Um, you know, cafes that will only serve white patrons, or had separate entrances for white and black patrons, and different seating areas, different water fountains. Here's a water fountain. Um, Different theaters, all sorts of uh, elements of segregation throughout the South, right? Throughout the South, and in a lot of different areas. I remember my grandmother, who's going to turn 90 on April 23rd, she told me about how she grew up in segregated Louisiana. And the first time she moved to Ohio in the north, all of her friends are really worried, like, how are you gonna sit next to a black person on the bus? And it turned out not to be an issue. But yeah, you can see, like, growing up in that system, this creates this kind of cultural issues, and this cultural hatred and this racism, and it permeates that from generation to generation to generation, and it's something that's really difficult to overcome. And American society and American history really has not had a good go at trying to overcome this level of institutionalized racism and segregation. Even if you look at our schools today, our schools are still highly segregated, even though school segregation has been um, illegal since 1954. Okay, so that's the kind of issue of racism and segregation in the first half of the 20th century. And we know that people were fighting against it. The NAACP is started in 1909. You have W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey and the Harlem Renaissance, and others who are fighting against this segregation and this racism, but their successes are limited, especially throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. There are a couple of things that kind of change the system that will eventually allow for a much larger and much more successful civil rights movement to take off in the 1950s and 60s. And I think it's important to understand that when we look at what caused the civil rights movement to really take off, we have to start with a court case called Gitlow versus New York in 1925. When you look at Gitlow versus New York, what ends up happening here, and this is dealing with whether or not the Bill of Rights actually applies to state law, Remember, during the Reconstruction period and as Jim Crow becomes the norm in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court had argued that the Bill of Rights did not apply to state law, that it only applied to federal law. Well, Gitlow is going to change that. It's going to say that you can apply the Bill of Rights to some state laws, not all of them, right? For example, if, this idea that you have freedom of speech, is that protected against the state from taking your freedom of speech, or is that only a protection from the federal government taking your freedom of speech? And what Gitlow is going to say, and the court case of Gitlow says that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and those amendments apply to the state laws in certain cases. This is what's called incorporation. You'll learn more about it in government next year. But think about it. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. And no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge these privileges or immunities. Now, during the Reconstruction period, the Supreme Court had said this only applies to the U.S. government, not to the state governments. And Gitlow is going to say, no, this applies to the state governments. This means that the state governments are not allowed to abridge those rights and those privileges of citizens. And so this is going to be huge, because the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all African Americans in the United States, and said that it is illegal to deny them those rights of citizenship, is now going to be applied to state law. And this is a effort that will then be taken up by NAACP lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Section, and they will start pushing for civil rights legislation in the 1930s and 40s, and civil rights cases in the 1930s and 40s, and they're really going to get the ball rolling. Right, they're going to have several, minor successes in the 1930s and 40s, which will lead to the huge success in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. And so this is really what we're seeing here, right? So like when we talk about causes, what's happening? There's an actual institutional change here, a precedent change in the court system that says, listen, the laws of the United States must protect people regardless of their race. And now those lawyers can take that new precedent, the precedent of Gitlow, and they can start saying, listen, Gitlow says that the Bill of Rights applies to the states and that you can't deny African Americans the rights of citizenship. So they can start pushing that forward in an attempt to get rid of Jim Crow and that segregation. You also have all of the African American soldiers coming back from World War II and the creation of the Double V campaign, that early civil rights movement in the 1940s, victory against fascism in Europe, victory against racism in the United States, which is going to create a lot of momentum going forward as Americans start to think about what it means to be American. What did we actually fight for in World War II? Can you argue that you are America's, the world's, arsenal of freedom and democracy if you're denying freedom and democracy to 12% of your population? Jackie Robinson will help out with this as well, right? To see an African-American man succeed so well at baseball in the 1940s is going to open up a lot of people's eyes. Again, a lot of it's about, showing that this antiquated, racist, power system that had been created and pushed upon American society from early on in American history is really not based in any sort of actual fact. It's just based in the fact that people are wanting power over others. All right, and Jackie Robinson is going to really open up a lot of American eyes, especially in the North and the West, as they become more aware of the situations that African Americans face in the Deep South. The Cold War will also push Americans towards a civil rights movement, because it'll be easy for civil rights activists to say, listen, if you're claiming to be this arsenal of freedom, right, against the Soviet oppression. How can you oppress? And the Soviet Union will help, because one of the big propaganda campaigns the Soviet Union will use against the United States is look at how they treat African Americans. And this will lead a lot of Americans to say, we can't be this, and we have to change. And that's not a great reason to do it, right? The best reason to do anything is because it's right, because it's morally right to not subjugate human beings. But this will push quite a few Americans into the civil rights movement as they want to look better in comparison to the Soviet Union. And finally, Truman. Truman is extremely important. He's our first real civil rights president, and we need to talk a little bit about him. Harry S. Truman probably didn't start out thinking he was going to be a civil rights president, but as soldiers were coming home from the war, he was very influenced by the Double V movement. He was also enraged when he hears the story of Isaac Woodard, who was a World War II veteran who was beaten and tortured by Southern cops to the point where he was blinded. And as the news of his torture and beating hit the newspapers, Truman was so mad at it that he ordered a council on civil rights. All right, he orders a council of different advisors and people to come together and investigate civil rights and investigate what's happening. All right, and the report that they create is called To Secure These Rights, and it's extremely important because in 1948, Harry Truman will fully support the recommendations of this document to secure these rights, and that's going to create a huge shift in the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party used to be the party of the South, but starting in the 1930s, right, FDR, who's from New York, started bringing in more and more African American votes because of the New Deal coalition. By 1948, Truman feels comfortable enough to upset most of the Southern Democrats, and so he will take a big gamble, and he will fully support civil rights in the 1948 Democratic platform, and that will create this rebellion in the election of 1948, in which a whole bunch of Southern Democrats will rebel. They'll push Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate in 1948. It's called the Dixiecrat Rebellion, but in the end, Truman ends up winning in the election of 1948. He puts his support behind civil rights, and he makes that a main part of the Democratic platform going forward. And he will do something that hadn't been done since the Civil War. He will desegregate the military. With Executive Order 9981, Truman will desegregate the military, will integrate the military, and this will be one of the first major victories of the civil rights movement.
We've made progress in spreading the blessings of American life to all our people. There has been a tremendous awakening of American conscience on the great issues of civil rights, equal economic opportunities, equal rights of citizenship, and equal educational opportunities for all our people, whatever their race or religion or status of birth. So as I empty the drawers of this desk, and as Mrs. Truman and I leave the White House, we have no regret. We feel we have done our best in the public service.
All right, so if you couldn't hear him, he said that the goals were equal economic rights, equal rights of citizenship, and equal access to education. And I think that really sums up a lot of what the civil rights movement was about when we get into the late 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s. Now, Truman will lose the election of 1952 to... well, he doesn't lose it. He doesn't run. But the Democrats will lose in 1952. Dwight Eisenhower will take over in January of 1953. He is not a proponent of civil rights. He does not believe that that's the federal government's opportunity. As Roy Wilkins says, President Eisenhower was a fine general and a good, decent man, but if he had fought World War II the way he fought for civil rights, we would all be speaking German now. Which just, his point is that Eisenhower was not focused on it. He had a couple major issues when it comes to civil rights. The first one, he appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, for those of you who remember George Takei's graphic novel, Earl Warren was a California politician. He had risen to the point of California governor. In 1952, he wanted to be the Republican nominee for president, and in order to get Earl Warren on his side to support him, Dwight Eisenhower promised him a spot on the Supreme Court the first time it opened. So what ends up happening is in 1954, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court dies, and so Eisenhower, good to his word, appoints Earl Warren as the Chief Justice. And this is going to completely change the Supreme Court. Earl Warren is going to be one of the most active and progressive Supreme Court justices we've ever seen. And his first case as Supreme Court Chief Justice will be Brown versus the Board of Education. And it's in Brown versus the Board of Education that you have the major precedent-changing response. There's a young girl in Topeka, Kansas, who had to walk across railroad tracks and across open fields just to get to the black school in Topeka, Kansas, even though the white school was right around the corner for her. So her case, along with several others, were put together by the NAACP. They took it to the Supreme Court and said that there's no such thing as separate but equal, that segregation in schools must end, and the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren agrees. In Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court argues that Plessy versus Ferguson was wrong, separate but equal is not a thing, and therefore we must desegregate schools. That was Brown versus the Board of Education 1. They came out the next year in Brown versus the Board of Education 2, and they say that schools should desegregate with all due haste. Now, that's a very important phrase, with all due haste. With all due means that you take your time. Haste means that you go fast. So what does that mean? Well, by saying with all due haste, the Supreme Court did give schools kind of an out, saying, listen, we understand that you're going to have to make plans and you're going to have to try to figure out how to navigate the integration of your schools. So you do it as fast as you can. And there will be schools in the South that won't desegregate until the 1970s. All right, late 1950s into the 1960s and 1970s. Now, in response to Brown versus the Board of Education, white Southerners will protest en masse. A lot of white Southern families will take their kids out of school because they don't want their white children to go to school with black children, and you will see the growth of private schooling and homeschooling in the South, which is something that will continue on up until today. The other big event of Eisenhower's presidency will be the Little Rock Nine. Little Rock Nine were 9 high schoolers who were trying to go to the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, decided to block the entrance of these 9 young students who wanted to go to school and try to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. And this becomes a huge showdown in Arkansas, which is part of the Deep South, which is part of the South. You have a state governor who is defying a Supreme Court order and who is basically thumbing his nose at the federal government. And so what ends up happening is Eisenhower will take control of the National Guard in Arkansas, and he will bring in the 101st Airborne Division, which is like the most elite of the American airborne divisions, and they will forcibly integrate the school, basically force Governor Faubus to open up the school to these 9 black students. I always like to show this picture because I think it's important. Forever, this young lady right here will be a symbol of the hate, of the white hatred of civil rights and integration and inequality. And just be aware when you decide to go out that do you want to be this person right here? And I say that because I also think that we have to keep in mind that this stuff is not gone. All right. This young man will always be a symbol of hate. He with their tiki torches. If you don't remember this incident, this was the Confederate statue incident in Charleston. where they were taking down the Robert E. Lee statue, and a bunch of white men showed up because they were so angry at it. And now he will forever be that symbol of racism in the 21st century, just as she is this symbol of hatred and racism in the 20th century. So just be aware of that. You know, they both are examples of this idea of white massive resistance. That there was this white resistance to civil rights, that African Americans and their white allies fought for civil rights throughout the South. There were probably the majority of whites who resisted it or did not want to be a part of it. They wanted to keep what they called the status quo, which for them was Jim Crow, and their spot as the top race in the South as far as power is concerned. And they were afraid that any changes that would come about because of the civil rights movement would take away their power. Remember, I think there's an old saying that to the privileged, equality seems like oppression, right? That if you've lived your life in a privileged situation, if you lived your life, if you were a white Southerner up until the 1950s and 60s, whether or not you understood your privilege, you had privilege in that society. You were able to serve on juries, you were able to get certain licenses, and you were able to vote, and you were able to do things that privileged your spot in society. And the fact that there were now groups of people who were demanding equality will create this sense of oppression amongst those white Southerners. And you're going to see them react in very violent ways. Dallas was not immune to this. There's a lot you can go out and research about Dallas and its civil rights issues, but they'll create white citizens councils and other groups in order to try to keep schools from desegregating. Now, an old adage in politics is politicians are not leaders; they are highly attuned followers. All right, and so when we talk about civil rights, understand that for the most part, it's not the politicians who are leading this. It is going to be the people. And I think this is one of the most important aspects of the civil rights movement, is that the people are going to be leading it. Whether it's the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King Jr., or it's Little Rock 9, or it's SNCC and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with the lunch counter sit-ins in the Carolinas, or it's the Freedom Rides with CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, or it's the March on Washington. Whatever it is, when you look at the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, neither one of those things happen without a massive resistance of the people. It is the people who are going to be pushing for this change, and the politicians will only act once they feel like the tide has turned and it was time, right? They're not leading it. The people are leading it. So always remember that. The good thing to do here is to go look. If you don't know any of these, go look them up. These are the major events that will lead us to the Civil Rights Act and then eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65. All right, is people marching, demanding change, right? For example, you look at Freedom Summer and the Selma March. This is people who are demanding voter registration and the right to vote. All right. The Freedom Summer is SNCC and CORE invited a whole bunch of college kids down to Mississippi in order to register voters in Mississippi, and this led to what they call the Freedom Summer. So these, young, early 20s white middle class kids are coming down to Mississippi and helping register African Americans to vote, because at that point, 1964. 65, I think roughly about 3 to 4% of African Americans in the state of Mississippi were registered to vote. So that's what that's what they were down there to do. And they're going to be met with resistance from the KKK and from white supremacist groups throughout. There's going to be bloodshed and murder and death. But that's what they're going to do. And all of these will use the mass media of television to their advantage. All right. One of the great successes of the civil rights movement is the ability to use mass media and television to help garner support. If I was a middle-class white American in the North, I may not truly understand what it's like for African Americans in the South. So whether it's the boycotts or the sit-ins or the freedom rides or the freedom summer, what you're now seeing is that civil rights activists are using the television camera to really upset the system and upset the status quo. Because if I am just a middle-class northerner, can I watch Southern sheriffs turn on massive water hoses or release dogs or beat these young protesters who are doing nothing violent? They're just walking. And then sit there and be like, okay with that. And what ends up happening is that people are watching the nightly news. They're seeing these images of these horrific beatings that are taking place, and they're starting to change their mind. Like, oh my God, what is happening here? Why is the South just destroying these people for marching? Right? And this creates more sympathy in different parts of the country. Because there was they would go through trainings, these civil rights organizations, whether it was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or CORE, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They would go through these trainings in which they would train their protesters, their activists, not to respond. Like, you're going to get spit at, you're going to be yelled at, you're going to be called all sorts of names, you're going to be hit, you cannot respond, you cannot fight back. Because once you fight back, that changes the narrative. But if you just sit there and you are peacefully non-compliant, then what the camera shows is angry white people attacking you for no reason. There's one big misconception with Martin Luther King Jr. and this idea of nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent applied to the activists, not to the people that they were resisting. In fact, the whole point of nonviolence resistance was to get the other side to be violent. They understood, the activists understood, that if they did not respond violently, they would win the message and they would win the day. Right? It's a huge change, and they were using mass media. They were using this new form of media, television, to really get their message out there. It's going to be highly successful in the South in the early 1960s. All right, and I think that's important when we talk about MLK. There's a lot of mythology around MLK. MLK is seen as this kind of more conservative civil rights activist who didn't want to do much change, just wants voting rights. I think that's just such a misinterpretation of who he was. Martin Luther King Jr. was a socialist who believed that the government, he demanded the government, take on more responsibility. He was one of the big purveyors of the fight against poverty. I mean, he was in Memphis in 1968 helping to organize a sanitation union strike in order to fight for better wages and better conditions for African American workers in Memphis, Tennessee. He thought that American capitalism, American war efforts were one of the causes of the mass brutality and death and starvation of people of color around the world. And he fought against that in a very violent way. But he was never violent, and his followers weren't violent. He was just inciting violence in others in order to win the day. So when we call him nonviolent, yes, that's true. He was never violent. But he would always make sure that the other side did. He wanted them to react. He wanted them to show themselves for who they truly were. And that was his brilliance, and that was the whole movement's brilliance in the early 60s. All right. You don't have to do that. All right. So when we keep going, the Voting Rights Act has a huge significance here. Here are the deep southern states who had the biggest voting restrictions and registration restrictions against African Americans. before the Voting Rights Act and then after the Voting Rights Act. And you can see Mississippi, the dramatic increase from, about 3-4% all the way up to almost 60% registered. And so what you're seeing here is a dynamic shift in the South that would be felt. And you're still seeing that. We're still fighting that. A few years ago, the Supreme Court actually shot down several parts of the Voting Rights Act. And what you're witnessing now, what you're living through now, is a new form of voter restriction. We've seen all these southern states start to apply these new voter restrictions, whether it's IDs or whatever else, in order to stop certain groups from voting, right? But the Voting Rights Act early on had a tremendous amount of success. Now, I would be remiss if I talked about civil rights and only stopped at Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolent resistors in the early 60s. The civil rights movement will last well into the 70s. Starting in about 64, 65, you're going to see a turnover from the more nonviolent resistance of Martin Luther King Jr. to the more aggressive resistance that we know of as Black Power. Black Power first comes around with Stokely Carmichael, who takes over SNCC, who takes over the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But really, he's feeding off of Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey and these other black nationalists who had been in the United States from before. So let's talk a little about Malcolm X. He was one of the leaders of the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam is a civil rights group in that Malcolm X will be a big part of. He'll change his name. His name is not Malcolm X, but he decides to get rid of his last name because most African Americans tended to have the last name of the person of the family who owned them and owned their family as slaves. So he got rid of his last name and he just used X. And when we look at his idea was very similar to that of Marcus Garvey, that African Americans could not get along with white Americans, and therefore they needed to basically not engage. They needed to be radical, they needed to demand equality, and they needed to just not engage. Don't buy things from white businesses. Don't engage in business with white business owners. And really start to kind of segregate. And then threaten if you need to. Threaten violence if you need to. That was a big part of it. One of his big speeches is by any means necessary, right? And basically he argued that black is good. Right, and you start seeing this change in the late 60s into the 70s with the growth of the Afro, and colleges starting to create African American studies programs, and you get rid of any version of the N-word, and this becomes a part of this kind of movement in Black Power, saying black is not bad, right? You've been taught that black was bad, but black is not bad. And so we just, and kind of pushing forward this idea that we don't need to try to make ourselves look like white Americans, that we can be happy who we are. And you can go and watch these. I'm gonna play this one because I think it's important to play this one. But you can kind of understand the difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X by listening to this one. Oh, come back here. Well, maybe not. Try to do something, it doesn't work. All right, so make sure that you go and check that one out on your own, okay? But if you notice the title, it's about his speech against police brutality. That was a big concern of a lot of Black Power advocates. When we talk, you've lived in a society that has talked a lot about police brutality against African Americans. That's not a new issue. That's been an issue since the end of the Civil War, is police brutality against African Americans, and that's something that we'll continue to fight until you see some major changes. Okay, So Stokely Carmichael will take over the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he will start pushing this concept of Black Power. Then that'll be taken over by H. Rap Brown, and both will kind of push SNCC to be much more radical and much more Black nationalist as the 60s move on. And really, you see this turnover from 64 to 65 to the late 60s. There's a huge turnover because what ends up happening is the civil rights movement moves out of the South and moves into the North. And it focuses less on social political issues like voting, and it focuses more on economic issues like equality. And once you start seeing the fight for equality, you're going to start seeing fewer and fewer white Americans actually support it, and you're going to see riots. You're going to see more violence as African Americans demand economic equality as well as political and social equality. One of the big iconic movements and groups that dealt with Black Power and this economic equality would be the Black Panther Party. This was founded in Oakland, California. All right, and they are very similar to Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, and they practice what they call militant self-defense. And this idea is that they would walk around with guns and they would, as a kind of a threat, saying, "Listen, don't bother us." All right. And I think when people think about the Black Panthers, that's what they really think about. They think about the kind of iconic beret and the gun and this kind of aggressive stance that the Black Panthers took towards law enforcement and the government as a whole. But really, they were focused on economic power. They have several big things that they're known for. If you've noticed, a big talk right now is about all of the food that school districts are giving away, right? The free food programs, whether it's breakfast or lunch. The Black Panthers were one of the first adopters of this idea. They started a kindergarten free breakfast program because they said kids cannot go to school and learn well if they're hungry, and so they would start giving out free breakfasts. And this is something that's going to be picked up nationwide as more and more schools give out free breakfasts to students who can't afford food. Then you also have these pop-up clinics and stations to help immunize and help take care of the communities. And really, they were this kind of community organization that was there to help take care of their community. And this is something that they don't really want you to see, right? Because they would rather you see this image of the Black Panthers, right, than this image of the Black Panthers. Okay. The federal government hated the Black Panthers. They will use what's called the Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO, to infiltrate and investigate the Black Panthers. They will bring hundreds of lawsuits against the Black Panthers. They will raid and murder several Black Panthers. They will send in undercover agents. And basically what the government will do is they will start attacking the Black Panthers as a terrorist organization and will help demolish the Black Panthers. Okay. So when we talk about what happened, why did the civil rights movement decline? Well, the biggest reasons is the economic recession and the movement north. As African Americans start demanding economic equality in the inner cities, as they started demanding economic equality in the north, right, fewer and fewer white Americans will support them. And then there's a recession at the end of the 60s into the early 70s due to Vietnam. And that's going to create, as more and more white Americans feel the pinch of the recession, there are fewer that are going to be supportive of economic equality for African Americans. All right, especially the unions who will fight against the incorporation of African American workers into the unions. All right, Vietnam becomes kind of the activist focus by the end of the 60s. All right, as more and more white activists start to fight against Vietnam than they do for civil rights. And then, of course, you have the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X is assassinated in 63, and then Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in 68. And that's quickly followed by the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who may or may not have been a civil rights advocate if he had become president. And that's going to create this loss of leadership in the movement. This image right here is iconic. This is from the 1968 Olympics, and there's a Black Power symbol. Interesting note that this guy right here actually supported them. He didn't want to put up the salute because it's not his salute, but he's actually going to suffer when he gets home. He's from Australia. You can go look him up. But he actually loses a lot of sponsorship and a lot of popularity because of his support of these two young men in their fight for equality. All right. So that's it. If you have questions, please email me or jump on WebEx. That is definitely not all of civil rights. There's a lot more we could have talked about, but I wanted to keep it as small as possible. All right. Thank you.